think I can get to see the next one. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for this speech. I think we have now a quarter of an hour for discussion. Are there some quick points? Or should I? Yeah, please.
Thank you for this excellent speech. I really enjoyed it very much. I've got two questions, or one question. One question, actually. I think this tension between control and trust is a very important point. When I consider Austria, we don't like control at all. We haven't got much trust in institutions, which is probably a worldwide phenomenon. And I think one of the difficult things is we have cultivated a marvelous, a sublime series of subversive, how do you call it, subversive measures in Austria. So how to build on a culture of real responsibility, how to build on trust. That's one of the most difficult things I think we have to learn in Austria. And the second thing is the tension between simplicity and complexity. How do we cultivate a sense of complexity so that we don't get too many trade-offs, as we've called them, so that people really know that it's important to change things, but it's not easy to change things. How can we work on that? That's the second big question that relates to the first one.
Should we collect 2 or 3? Yeah, I think it would be good to collect 2 or 3 points.
Coming back to a knowledge-based or knowledge-related policy, as you correctly said, academic research takes a lot of time, which policy doesn't have. So can you suggest any kind of intermediate level of supportive knowledge, of delivering knowledge to policy, something between academic research and, as you said, anecdote knowledge? Maybe some expert level or something like that?
You.
Did you see any clear links to the political cultures in the countries? For example, in Austria, for a very long time, it was rather a question of identity and belonging to a specific political party or ideological bloc. How you would defend and argue things in educational policies, and it's slowly, getting more diverse, and you can have more different positions, and it's not so much a question of belonging anymore. But still, I would see that as a major reason why we didn't succeed so much to use evidence, statistics, and so on.
So I think I have another hour, right? That's probably how long it will take me to answer these super simple questions. I will start with the last first and go backwards. The political element is a very interesting one, and I think you never get away from it. I mean, I think it was true in all the systems. The one which for us it was most obvious was Poland, because it was very explicit that there was, as everywhere else, Poland's teachers are aging, so most of them grew up under a communist regime. So the new government, the people in the ministry are often quite a lot younger than them. The sort of shining stars in their 30s, mid-30s, are the new people making policy, and the teachers who are 50, 60 are receiving this policy, but really have come from a completely different ideological world. And this element of really fundamentally believing that being evaluated would be used to punish you came very much, at least our researcher said, and he was middle-aged, so he grew up under communism. He said it really came from communism, that they really just believed that if they allowed people to evaluate them, they just had no trust that it would be used to help them, that it was a way to control them. So that, for me, was the most obvious example of that. It's the most stark one. But I think you could argue it for all of it. I find it intellectually quite an interesting puzzle that science is meant to be so objectively neutral. And as scientists, we're always trying to push to find answers to what we think are simple questions, or at least simple answers to difficult questions. And yet it seems impossible to, in education at least, to use that without falling into political fields. And that's one of the things we struggle with. I think this is something that we need to do more to get away from. It's a pitfall for education in general, I think, and it's understandable on one level because education is so intensely tied to national identity and how we think of ourselves and how we are forming our future citizens, that people are very passionate about it. And once you get passion, you have less logic. And so a lot of the arguments are not particularly logical. But I think it's part of every system, actually. In terms of the research, the timeline for research and the intermediary level, I mean, I think there are a number of different ways to go with this. Some of the interesting ones I've seen are the Netherlands, for example, has, in terms of knowledge production, they have set aside quite a large amount of money for actually commissioning research. So the government identifies policy-relevant questions and commissions research from researchers, from the academic community, but says you have 6 months. So it's not really basic research. What it is it's a review of what's already out there, more or less. But they also sort of, because they try and have strategic thinking, they try and plan for what will be important to them in 2-3 years. And so they are actually trying to build a system where they are funding the research that they consider useful for their policy-making questions. That's one attempt to deal with that. Other attempts, for example, come from the UK, where they support a process called rapid evidence assessment. Again, it's not basic research, but it's taking and doing a large synthesis of the literature and meta-analysis of what is out there and review of the quality of the different elements to try and come up with, this is the evidence, in 4 months we can give you, this is what we know, this is what we know we don't know, and this is how solid the data is, which is helpful. It's not always giving you the answer you want. And in other countries, they do have this intermediary expert level. But the problem with that is you then quickly get to the question of, well, who are the experts? And then you get to, sometimes the experts are very politically chosen. So you have this expert panel, yes, we believe that, you must, I'm trying to think of a politically neutral thing, but you must have, in France right now, it's having the length of the school day. And they can find scientists who will argue for and against it. And it's really, part of it is about political affiliation, part of it is also about the research they've done, of course. So I do think it's very useful to have people on call to be able to ask, the minister needs to know this, what is the answer? But in a lot of cases, there is no one answer. And so having the brokerage agencies that I talked about, which is an actual institution, which is objective, which is apart from the ministry, that can actually be quite useful in terms of providing politically neutral advice that doesn't have the pitfall of actually relying on a particular subset of experts. But better to use an expert than not use an expert, at least. And for the first two questions, I don't have answers to those questions. Those are exactly the questions that all the countries we work with struggle with. The meeting that I talked about in June, the keynote will be given by Ben Levin, who is a professor at the University of Toronto and who was also Deputy Minister of Education in Toronto, and had very good results when he was Deputy Minister, and has a very, what he says is trying to Well, he just sent me the title of his talk. It's called The Simple Art of Governing Complex Education Systems. And so what he tried to do as deputy minister, and what he tries to do in his research is, so you start with student learning. I mean, this is what we want, right? We want the best student learning possible. That's our output. And then it's taking a strategic look at, okay, we have we don't want 20 different things. We have 3 things we want to aim at. So when he was deputy minister, he wanted to retain students to graduation, a higher percentage of students to graduation. He wanted to raise high school scores by a certain percentage to have a different element, and I can't actually remember the third one. I think it was bring up the performance of migrants and underrepresented individuals. And so what they did was, just in terms of keeping those as priorities, was thinking about whole of system reform as a way of making those possible. And he will be better placed to answer this than I will, so please come in June. But his argument is that by actually setting these very deceptively simple points and keeping the focus on them, it actually allowed to reduce a lot of the complexity and treat all the little elements, treat all the pieces that he had to treat, but by keeping in mind these 3 goals, to really sort of streamline the process. And I mean, I'm sure there are detractors who would say he didn't succeed, but in terms of the measures that they set when they started and when he left 8 years later, they had achieved them. And so one could argue, at least for political purposes, that he was successful in that time period. So again, I would prefer that he give you that answer, but I think what I'm hearing is the importance of strategic thinking, identifying a small subset of goals that everybody can agree on because they're politically neutral, right? You want people to do better in school. This is nobody's going to debate that point. You want people to more people to graduate from high school. It's not a debatable point. Nobody's going to say no. And then pushing, how do you get to those points? And that to him seemed like the key to making that happen. And the trust and I really don't have an answer to the trust and subversiveness one. It is the right question, and I think there's no answer yet. But thanks.
So I think we don't have much more time for discussion, and I would like to ask one question myself. And because it is now, I think, in the room, I have really problems with this brokerage. Because if you see this difference of practical knowledge and formal knowledge, and you have a very weak formal knowledge, we know this, then I think if you put the focus very much on brokerage, you are in fact pushing, there is a danger of pushing the formal knowledge aside, and also to make the gap between the practical knowledge and the formal knowledge deeper somehow. This is one question, so we have 2 others. Yes?
I have a question which is about accountability of politicians. I feel that there is a mismatch between the time they would need to make reform, and if they think strategically, they would need to think in a period of, let's say, 5, 10 or 15 years. To change PISA results, you need to change the first grades of school, and you will measure it 10 years later. But the idea of accountability taken by the public and the media is that the maximum gives them 3 or 4 years' time, and then they look whether something changed, and they make them accountable for reforms that actually had no time yet to show the effects. So how do you kind of see the role of media and public in this accountability process with the relatively short attention span?
No more. Okay.
All right, also great questions. And again, I'll do them in the reverse order. The question you just asked is work that I'm going to start on this summer. I think this question is exactly the question that we should be asking. I think we need to have a very serious discussion about this. It came up a little bit in terms of rankings and how are they used and by whom. But because it's very clear that, I mean, the media is I mean, they're doing their job. They're looking for news, they're presenting news, that's what they do. But in some senses, they're not always a neutral player. And they can have an enormous impact on the national dialogue, especially with easily publishable numbers or league tables. And there are real questions about, well, what is the responsibility of the press? What is the responsibility of the users of this information? If the press is simply a neutral vehicle to put it out there, then the responsibility lies with the user. And also, of course, what is the responsibility in terms of producing those indicators? I mean, no one wants to go back to where we just don't produce indicators because they get misused. It's obviously important to have them. But I think what we haven't had yet is a serious talk about, well, what, in a situation where we are building our indicator systems, and I think we can be justifiably proud with the kind of indicator systems we have in education now, but that we are still building capacity in terms of parents, teachers, governors, etc., to use those indicators in a sensible way. I think we need to be very thoughtful about how we use them and how we discuss them, because it is very, very easy to go very far with a simple message which is actually incorrect. And it's not about finger pointing, it's not about taking a sort of judgmental tone, but it is sort of raising the alarm to say, well, you know, the intention with having good research and indicators is to have open, transparent, clear vision of what's happening. But if this is then manipulated to allow for political maneuvering, or in some cases it's very clear that the people who use the indicators the best are actually very well-educated parents, that has real equity issues for the children of people who are not very well educated, or, you know, there are real questions on a system level for individual use of indicators. And the role of the media is actually very key in that. So I'm actually, in my head, planning a workshop on this topic exactly. So I will get back to you after I've thought about it some more. And in terms of brokerage, I mean, one of the things we always struggle with is how do we keep the emphasis and push on research knowledge, which we want to support and encourage, without taking away from the knowledge of practitioners, because of course that if I've understood you correctly, that's what you meant by formal knowledge. Is that right?
Formal knowledge from research.
Okay, yeah. So then for me, the role of the brokerage is to make sure that the access, so the research knowledge is available. It's available on time in a way that can be understood and a way that can be used. And there's also a push to actually use it by governance, but also by schools and by parents and by students. So it sort of becomes embedded in the whole system. And that's not... it might sound simplistic, but it's actually much harder. I see it as a much harder interaction, because education and in fact human behavior in general is actually quite resistant to formal knowledge. I mean, you've heard this before, but the example from health of hand washing, and how we know that hand washing before surgery is very important and necessary, and surgeons are extremely well-educated individuals who know that as well. But with all of this external formal knowledge, there was a very long period of time where they had to actually intervene and stop people and actually reconfigure an environment so you couldn't go into the operating theater without passing by the sink and have a list saying, did you wash your hands? I mean, literally getting into people's heads and stopping them to say, wash your hands. You know, I mean, these are very smart people. But using that formal knowledge is actually very hard for humans. And that's a great case of extremely smart people with a very simple behavior. And it took years and years to do, and there's still interesting research where, in fact, in small communities, it's still sometimes skipped, and they have to re-educate people or re-insist on it. So for education, for me, the question is, using brokerage to really push it, I don't think we run the risk of pushing it aside or keeping it separate. I think we really need to insist. I think we can't underestimate how hard it is for people to conceptually know something versus actually change behavior. So, I mean, I know that I should eat more vegetables. I mean, I know it, but I don't. So if I'm a teacher and I really want to do the best for my students, formative assessment is a great tool. But when you're tired and you're stressed and you have 20 students in front of you and you don't have any time, you can intellectually know you should use that, but your behavior, actually, you just don't have time to do it.
Yeah, but brokerage would not help you to eat vegetables.
Well,
so the alternative would be to bring the two forms directly together. This is professionalism.
But that's what when you look at the teachers specifically, that's what in England, when they work with practitioners, that's what they do. They bring the research to the classroom, and they actually bring it so that they're using it while they're doing stuff. So that's what they do, and that's what you have to do, I think, in order to make it part of the system.
Okay. So thank you very much. We